Hey guys, this is Nirpam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater Photo. Now today I want to talk about a camera I'm super excited about. I've been waiting years for it to come out, and this is the Sony A6700. This is Sony's newest APS-C mirrorless camera. Now for those of you that don't know what an APS-C camera is, an APS-C camera basically has a smaller sensor than a full-frame camera. It's been cropped 1.5 times. It results in a slight degradation of image quality, but not too much. So it's still a fairly professional system, and it's a little bit more affordable because that sensor is smaller, and the sensors tend to be the most expensive part of the camera. Now, there are also benefits of having an APS-C sensor. For underwater photography, a lot of people like APS-C sensors because you can take a full-frame macro lens, like this 90mm macro, and now you've got a 1.5 crop additionally that you wouldn't get on a full-frame camera, so you can get a little bit tighter, a little bit closer into subjects. So this is now, more like 140, 150. Now, if you were to compare a A6700 to something like the A7 IV, you're going to get a little bit more dynamic range in a full-frame sensor and a little bit better low light performance, so you'll have less noise when you're at higher ISOs with a full-frame sensor. Now that said, there's a lot in this camera, there's a lot to talk about, and I'm super stoked that I got to finally see it come to fruition. I was a little bit worried for a second there because it seemed like with all the full-frame cameras coming out and a lot of the A6000 series being discontinued, I wasn't sure if Sony was going to continue making APS-C cameras. Well, here we go. We've got an A6700, and it's pretty much, it's amazing. It's a professional APS-C level camera. It's got all the bits and pieces of a pro level Sony body, of a pro level full frame body with a crop sensor, which is great if you're a macro shooter and also great if you're a videographer. So I'm going to talk about my experience this week diving with the camera. It's been a really tough week. I don't know if you guys have seen the news, but in the Pacific Northwest, we've had 8 inches of rain. So I've been trying to drive around floods, get to dive sites, and everything's just been completely ruined in terms of visibility. There's a lot of water flow. There's even like 10 feet of fresh water when on some of the dive sites where I was diving, just because it was so much rain coming in. So that was challenging. The conditions were challenging, but on my last dive with this camera, I had an amazing dive. So you guys will see some of the footage from that and some of the photos. But basically, at one point I was actually taking photos of a fish, and I saw a tentacle go up over a rock, and here was an octopus, a giant Pacific octopus, which is kind of like the crown jewel of the Pacific Northwest. Now this was a medium-sized octopus, but of course I had my macro lens on, so I got some tentacle photos, and it was a lot of fun shooting with it and just a lot of fun diving overall. So overall, pretty tough conditions. I do have to say the sample wide-angle images that you're going to see are not my favorite. They're not my best that I've ever created, but the visibility was really poor. There was a ton of rain, there was no sun. So what you're going to see in these images is a really high performing camera, because I had to push my ISO all the way up to 1500, even 2000 to get some of the green backgrounds in these photos. And it was a good test of what the camera can do. But of course, if you're disappointed by seeing the photos, don't be. It's still an amazing camera. It's just, it had to deal with some of the toughest conditions I've had out there diving. I normally wouldn't go out for a dive on a day like yesterday. Now, before I get into this video, I just wanted to make sure you guys like and subscribe to our channel. If you like this video, it really puts it out there to a lot of people, and that way they can see it and make the right decision for themselves when they're shopping for an underwater camera, or if they're just interested in underwater photography. It's a lot of fun. So getting into this review, I wanted to start with the price point. Of course, you're probably wondering, okay, how much does this camera actually cost? Well, the body itself is $13.99, which I think is a fair price. Canon does have some excellent competitors with the Canon R10, the Canon R100, the Canon R50 that are priced a little bit better. Even the Canon R7 is probably priced a little bit better. So that does make it compelling, but if you're a Sony shooter or you want to stick with Sony because you have Sony lenses, well, I think it's a really good price. And going from this to say an A7 IV is over $1,000. So it does have its place in the market, and I think it was priced well for what it gives you. Now, if you are a Sony A6000 shooter, I do think it's worth the upgrade, and I'll get into why that is in a moment. Okay, so when it comes to underwater photography, the A6700 can take 26 megapixel photos. Now, that's not a huge change from the older 24 megapixel sensors that we saw in like the A6400, but it is a couple megapixels of resolution. You're not going to really notice the difference, but it's nice to have that. I do think for an APS-C camera, 26 megapixels is a lot of pixels, but it's not too much where you start to get noise at higher ISOs. And as I said before, I was able to push the ISO to 1500, 2000, and still get fairly usable images. Now you do need to do some, post-production and get rid of that noise in Lightroom, but it did a pretty good job, and it was really tough conditions. So for wide angle photography, I was fairly impressed. The camera also has 5-axis in-body image stabilization. For those of you that don't know what it is it's basically a feature where the sensor on the camera, it's almost like it's on a gyroscope. So when you move the camera, the sensor is going to move with you. And that allows you to shoot at slower shutter speeds without getting motion blur from your hands. I pushed the shutter speed down to 1/15 of a second, had no problems with the photos coming out in sharp focus. It really helps having strobes as well, because that will freeze your image too. Now, when it comes to the strobe sync speed, that's 1/160th of a second. I do wish it was quicker, but that's okay. I still usually only shoot at 1/160th of a second or lower. And in many cases, if it's really dark, I'm gonna be below that. So for macro photography, again, it would have been nice to see 1/160th of a second, but having that in-body image stabilization also helps. So it's not really a huge issue in my opinion. Now, one thing that I did see was an issue for underwater photography and video is the battery life on this camera. Unfortunately, after 2 dives, now given they were long dives, I think my second dive was 90 minutes, my first dive was 50 minutes, so it's a lot of diving. But with 2 dives, I was at 35% battery life left, which means I would expect at maximum for this camera to last about 3 dives. I would probably try to replace the battery every 2 dives. So that was a little bit disappointing, but it's not the end of the world for what you're getting out of this camera. And what you're getting is autofocus, and that's what I really want to talk about. So I think the A6700 is worth the upgrade from the A6400 or any of the other A6000 line cameras because of the autofocus system in the camera. The camera's been redesigned with a new AI autofocus processor. It's the same one we've seen on the high-end A7R5 and the ZVE1, and it basically allows the camera to acquire subjects a lot quicker and a lot more accurately, and I saw that in this camera. For one, this camera actually does animal eye autofocus tracking, and it works with fish. I was taking video, I was taking photos, and the autofocus box would pick up the eye all of a sudden, and I was able to get shots. Now, this was mostly with the macro lens, so it is mostly just a macro feature still, but for the first time I can say with an APS-C camera from Sony, I was able to get that to work. And the acquisition is spot on, it's accurate. Almost all of my shots were in focus, and I was just so happy to shoot with a camera with a 90mm macro lens where my lens is not just hunting all the time and looking for subjects. It was as spot on as with the A7R5. Now, it doesn't do as well in low light, so that's important to know, and it's not quite as quick as the A7R5 because you don't have the same processors in here, but it did a really, really good job for an APS-C camera, and I think it's well worth the money. You're getting a professional autofocus system in a body that's only $13.99. Now, when I was in low light, even though this camera is rated to -3 stops below normal exposure when it comes to picking up autofocus, I was able to use the camera without a focus light. For the most part, it did really well. It's not going to do as well as some of the full frame offerings from Sony, but the low light autofocus was decent enough. I do recommend a focus light if you can get one. Finally, if you're an action shooter, the A6700 can shoot up to 11 frames per second. A lot of strobes these days can actually keep up with that. So it's actually pretty cool. I think it's a great system if you are an action shooter. If you want more frames per second, I would start looking at full frame cameras, but I do think 11 is just fine for most people, and it's certainly more than enough for me. So if you're going out there to shoot sharks, dolphins, any quick subjects, 11 frames per second is what you're going to get. Alright guys, let's move on to underwater video. This is really the grand finale for this camera, and it is the main reason I would upgrade to the A6700. If you're a video shooter, you need this camera, especially if you're kind of in that APS-C format. So the camera itself can do 4K 120. Now that is 4K at 120 frames per second, which is incredible. It's a lot of data. You need to make sure you have a card that is capable of accepting 4K 120, so make sure you reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com and we can recommend cards for this camera. We can sell you the camera and the lenses and all that too. But you do have to know that with 4K 120, you're getting a 1.5 times crop. That can be an advantage if you're doing some handheld macro video and you really need to slow things down and you might want a little bit more reach. But sometimes it's not as much of an advantage, especially if you're doing some wide angle video. So it's something to keep in mind. It's just something that you have to work around. But the 4K 60 in this camera is excellent. I was shooting that quite a bit when I was taking some video, and it's oversampled from 6K. You can see that quality difference. So it's taking basically a 6K frame, it's downsampling it down to 4K, and now you're getting a much more detailed image, even though it's still a 4K resolution. And that's pretty cool to have that feature available. Now, it has built-in LUTs and also log capabilities, so I was shooting S-Log3 most of the time when I was taking video. The files are awesome. You can pull out a ton of color and detail from the files, ton of dynamic range. And finally, the autofocus was surprisingly good. Now with the Sony 90, I did find that if I did leave my video in autofocus, it would hunt a little bit, and that was a little bit annoying, so you do want to lock your focus when you're going to shoot macro. But for wide angle, it's more than acceptable to use autofocus when you're filming, which is not something older versions of the camera could do. So that is really cool as well, and I really did kind of enjoy just letting the camera do its thing. It worked when it came to the animal eye autofocus tracking for video as well. So I was actually able to get the focus box over eyes when I was filming some sculpins and some other fish as well, mostly again with the macro lens. But overall, I think the crowning jewel of the A6700 is the video features. And I love shooting video with it. It's a small, compact system, as you can see right here, which makes it a great option for videographers, especially if you need a less expensive video camera. Now, if you're debating between the A6700 and the ZV-E1, I'm gonna say go with the ZV-E1 every day. We did a full review on the ZV-E1, and overall, the ZV-E1 is going to perform much better in low light, which is what you need as an underwater videographer. But if you're an underwater video shooter that needs some stills capability, well, I would go with the A6700. It's also about $1,000 cheaper than the ZV-E1, so that is another benefit to it. If you're looking for a really affordable video camera, well, it's going to be a tough call between the R7, the A6700, but overall, I'm probably going to go with the A6700 over the Canon R7. Now, one question that I've been getting from a lot of customers is, does the A6700 overheat? I did not run into any overheating issues, but I was filming in 50-degree water, so that's pretty cold. I have a nice Ike housing which has a good amount of airspace that helps that heat dissipate, and I didn't run into any overheating warnings. I filmed video quite a bit, but I also let the camera sleep in between those clips, and that's what I recommend doing. If you're thinking about this camera for underwater video, you're worried about it overheating, I just recommend shooting those few second clips that you're actually going to use. And if you're in situations where you need to film for an hour, then I would look at the Sony FX30, which is an awesome video camera. It has slightly different specifications than the A6700. It's going to be more geared towards the cinema shooter, so if you're just a video shooter, the FX30 is probably a good option. We sell housings for those too, but overall, I think the A6700 was very impressive. Now, let's talk about underwater housing options and lenses for this camera. Your lens options will actually change depending on what housing you're using. So currently there's two underwater housings for the A6700. There is this nice polycarbonate housing from Ike, and then there is the Nauticam aluminum housing as well. And we do expect Miralux will likely make an anodized aluminum housing for the A6700. Now, if you want to go with an Ike polycarbonate system, there's a few lens options that you can use. So you could use a 90mm macro lens for macro. I don't recommend the Sony 50mm macro lens. I think it's just way too slow for autofocus. Even though you do have the crop factor, I actually really enjoy shooting with the 90mm, and I think it's totally usable because the autofocus speed is so good in the A6700. So between the Sony 90 and the Sigma 105mm macro, those are the two that I would really recommend. This little thing right here is what I wanted to show you guys. This is the Sony 16-50. So if you're looking for a mid-range lens, or even a wide-angle lens, I was using this for wide-angle. This is the kit lens that comes with the camera if you get the kit from us. And what's really cool about it is it's absolutely tiny. I needed a dome without any extensions because this lens is so small it actually kind of sits behind the opening of the port on the housing. So this is how small the camera is with the kit lens, the 16-50. This lens is great if you want a Nauticam housing because you can actually zoom in and out and use wet lenses like Nauticam's WWL1 or the Fantasy UWL09F. So there's some wet lens options there that work really well with the system. You can also use a macro wet lens option, so that's probably the most versatile system. This lens can also be used behind an Ike-Light dome port, so you can zoom in and out in that Ike-Light dome port as well, and it's a nice mid-range kind of zoom, but I would kind of stick with this for wide angle and this for macro if you're going with the Ike-Light option. So those are kind of the main options. There is also a 16mm pancake lens from Sony that works well with the Ike-Light option. And if you really want a fisheye, I would recommend a Canon 8-15mm fisheye with the Sigma MC11 adapter. That's really the best kind of fisheye you're going to get. I haven't tried the Tokina 10-17 Canon version with the MC11 adapter. I don't know if that autofocus will work or how well it would work, but it's something I can look into if that's, if somebody out there watching is interested. Just send me an email at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com and I can look into whether that would be a good option, but the Tokina is also discontinued. So overall, if I was going to look for a fisheye, it'd probably be the Canon 8-15 with the MC11 adapter. So yeah, those are my kind of lens and housing options. I combined that all in one. Now I got to shoot with the Ike-Light housing, so I do want to do a quick overview of that because I think it's very interesting, and Ike-Light's actually kind of outdone themselves in some of the updates that they made to the housing. The first being that they've updated their dials. They're very, very easy to use underwater now because they've got these knobs with ridges that help you grip, especially with gloves. So that is one of the coolest updates I was playing around with. The TTL converter works amazing with this camera. That's particularly because if you're in spot metering mode with a Sony camera, you can actually assign the focus point to be your metering point, and that allows you to get accurate exposures on the focal point of your image, which is usually your subject. So it was cool using the TTL converter with the Sony A6700 with some Ike-Light strobes. I thought it worked excellent. All through electronic syncs, that makes it really accurate. And finally, what's really nice is you've got a nice back button that you can use for back button focus. You have a lever here and a pinch motion to take your shot. So I usually hit it with my thumb to focus and then take my photo with my finger. So it's pretty nice and streamlined. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna end the review here. I'm not just raving about this camera. I actually had a really, really enjoyable time shooting with it, and I think it's an awesome option for anybody who wants to take a Sony camera underwater. So if you're thinking about upgrading your Sony A6000, A6400, A6300, A6500, yes, this is totally worth the upgrade. The autofocus and video specs alone make it worth the upgrade. Now, if you're looking for your first APS-C camera, it's going to be a little bit tougher because there are great Canon options out there, but this is really an excellent option, especially if you want to use Sony lenses and you want the latest in Sony technology, because this camera has it all. So with that, guys, thank you so much for watching this review. Again, remember to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that that you want to put down in the comments below, make sure you drop them there and I will respond to those. Or send us an email at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. We'll get you set up with an underwater housing, lenses, a whole kit for you. We've got some amazing holiday specials out there, so make sure you ask about those as well, especially some secret deals for video shooters. So yeah, make sure you give us a call or send us an email and we'll get you set up. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you guys out there diving.